From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi again. Welcome to the show, Chicago Newsroom. Coming to you from Chicago, home of the building in all of North America with the highest floor that a human being can walk on and look out the window, and home of the highest up in the air glass cube that you can walk out into if that's your thing. Okay, Mayor Emanuel, it's your move. Call in all your developer friends this morning and feed them a big expensive lunch and tell them to get started on a 1,777-foot building for Chicago right away. Or you know what else you could do? Just call up the Donald and ask him to attach a bigger spire to the top of his building. You know, make it the biggest in the country. I bet Donald would like that. Well, anyway, on the show today, the legislators, the ones in Springfield who still haven't come up with any kind of a pension reform. And you should know, Kristen McQueary and the Tribune board, they're very unhappy about that. And one of the legislators in the Chicago City Council has had some harsh but fatherly words for the young insurgents who want to upset Mayor Emanuel's spending priorities if you start talking about all this crazy stuff like TIFs and police staffing levels. Alderman O'Connor warned them it would be the council wars all over again, and we wouldn't want that to happen, now would we? Well, here to explain the legislature and our failing municipal pride over having such a small, tall building. Kristen McQueary from Chicago Tribune Editorial Board, back again. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And Al Keefe from the mighty WBEZ 91.5 here
Hey,
again. So we have plenty to talk about today. Should we start in Chicago?
I think that's a good place to start in Chicago Newsroom, yeah.
Okay, let's start there then. So there was a city council meeting yesterday.
Right.
And it was a routine city council meeting. They re-regulated the horses, as far as I understand.
The biggest issue facing the city of Chicago was whether these horses would be taking the temperature at the right place so they're not too hot or cold.
Not on the horse, but right.
Right.
At
We're
the
not talking veterinary
versus-
medicine.
Right.
Yeah. So we have to take the temperature at
I think northerly instead of
O'Hare.
O'Hare,
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, but as we mentioned, Alderman O'Connor is very concerned that there's this rising insurgency in the city council of all of these rebels, these young rebels who remind him of himself when he was a young rebel against Harold Washington, I guess, and we wouldn't want to go back to that again.
No, this was a rare moment of drama and unexpectedness at a city council meeting. I should say, in full disclosure, I was not at the meeting yesterday, but I was so compelled by the person we had cover it when they came back that I listened back to the tape. And basically at issue here was a couple of issues that were buried in the Rules Committee, which has been called where good legislation goes to die. The word on the street is that the mayor didn't want him to come out. So some self-styled progressive aldermen from the Progressive Caucus tried to bring this stuff out of committee by invoking this rule that basically said if it sits there for too long, we can move to bring it out of committee. So they tried to do that. It didn't happen. But in the process came this whole debate about how to spend TIF surplus money and also about the process of things. And it pitted John Arena was sort of Alderman John Arena was sort of the main guy, 45th Ward Alderman talking about this. And at one point, Pat O'Connor, who was one of the Verdoli Act 29 for the record during the council wars, sort of brought out the specter of Council Wars 2.0, I think is what the Chicago Sun-Times called it, basically for trying to circumvent the systems that are in place, right? So,
like they were trying to do.
So it was a high-tension moment, but I mean, mathematically, you should say the votes are not there. I mean, the stuff failed to be discharged from the Rules Committee with like 11 votes and 15 votes for another item about an elected school board. So Verdoli Act 29 was a majority. That was, I mean, mathematically, the numbers were there. They could make some trouble. Not so much this time, but still, procedurally, you don't see those many fireworks anymore. Usually the last several city council meetings I've been to over the last few months have been
Well, I mean, a lot of this, though, again, we sort of make light of this, but they're talking about some very serious issues, and one of them is the staffing of our police department. Now, I know that Alderman Rick Munoz, offered up a bill for $25 million that would hire, he says, 500 police officers. Don't know if that math works out, but there are plenty of people who believe that we are deeply understaffed, and this notion of solving the problem by just giving everybody a lot of overtime seems it appears anyway to be a little short-sighted. Now, you guys cover this, and I'd love to know what you think about it and what you're hearing from your people that you cover.
I mean, we toss this idea around to the editorial board all the time. Is that the problem? Is our crime problem a staffing issue?
Yeah.
And we keep coming back to a couple points. One is we've been talking about staffing with the police department for 25 years. Even when we have more officers, it doesn't do something substantial over the long haul to decrease crime in some of these really hotspot areas of the city. And the other thing is we are broke. And yes, I realize we're spending a lot on overtime, but once you hire officers and then you're paying out benefit packages and eventually a pension for these officers, I think over the long haul, it is more expensive. And if you believe Superintendent McCarthy, we have more police per capita than other areas of the country as it stands now.
But here's the thing that I don't understand. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but my perception is that the police department is older than many police departments. It hasn't been refreshing itself at the rate that it probably should have been. So we had Frank Main on the show last week who said that, the people he's talking to, these police officers, many of the older ones, are pulling down 105, 110 grand a year now because of the overtime. So they love it. They think it's kind of cool because, frankly, a lot of this is not exactly dangerous work. So, and again, I'm not belittling them by saying that, but so you really have to ask yourself, is it the best policy to take the oldest police officers and just give them a bunch of money to work an extra 6 hours a day, or would it be better to invest the money in younger, newer recruits, training newer recruits, and having this be the future of the department? I mean, I don't know the answer to that.
I think all the officers are benefiting from overtime. I think even a lot of the younger officers are getting, are benefiting from overtime. But again, you have to either trust that the police department is replenishing new recruits at a pace that's keeping up, and you have to look at the long-term costs that a police officer costs the city in terms of health care benefits and pensions. And I do think for right now, it's a difficult sell for McCarthy and Emanuel because they've been saying for years since he came into office that we don't need more police. So to backtrack on that at this point is just politically complicated.
And again, as somebody who is a kind of a student of government, I think we probably would all agree that what happens with any big organization when you increase staffing is that it immediately just kind of dissipates. I mean, the effect of it dissipates because, again, the older people with more seniority will get themselves desk jobs. They'll move into, what human nature would tell you. You want to get the easier jobs, and you end up paying more overall for about the same level of service. So. Sorry.
I was going to say, the thing I wonder about, and I don't know the answer to this, is what is the effect of the quality of policing when you're putting a bunch of people on overtime? I mean, it made me think of this when we reported, I think last week, that the fire department was going to blow its overtime budget by more than twice what it was planning to spend. And I know some of these guys have to get called in on a day off, and they work 24-hour shifts. So that's a huge thing. But at what point is it diminishing returns if you're paying police overtime? I don't know the answer to that, but that's something that I was
thinking. The difference, though, is that the fire department thing is a sort of a one-time thing determined because of bureaucratic stuff that happened with the testing and everything else that they found themselves short, so they had to do this. But the police is an affirmative policy on the part of the city. They're saying, no, we're better off doing it this way. We want to run the department this way.
Yeah, but even with the fire department, that's what Emanuel has said, and that's one reason why they haven't brought themselves back up to speed. But still, overall budgeted staffing levels are down from what they were a couple of years ago. And why they don't bring that net level up higher is a question I still haven't gotten an answer to.
And to push back on that, there's been an argument for years that the fire department is overstaffed. I mean, it's a very different situation than the police department because, as we all know, the number of fires is dramatically down over the last 30 years, and the fire department is really now a medical department that puts out fires when they break out. I mean, it's kind of a very different organization. So yes, we probably could reduce the staffing in the fire department over a period of time, and no one would really, I think, it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, but the police department's a whole different animal, and there's a sort of a public perception of safety if they feel that there aren't enough of them.
Yeah.
So, did we resolve that?
Yes.
No, yeah, it was so good.
Just by talking it through.
We've talked it over.
We figured it out.
So the Chicago Tribune is perfectly happy to let the Chicago Police Department spend $100 million a year in overtime. You think that's better?
I think we look long term, and we are concerned about whether or not. I mean, if we're talking about staffing because we want to reduce crime, is that the most effective way to reduce crime? I don't think we're sold that that's the answer, and that we can hire more police and then and then feel better about our crime rate. And again, the long-term costs of personnel and hiring an officer are more taxing to the city than overtime.
Okay, all right. The other big thing that came up and that continues to roil in City Council is this thing about tax increment financing. And, probably the most boring topic.
We just
in
lost
the
all
world.
20 of your listeners just now. They're gone.
We're about to talk tips.
So since there's
We love
nobody watching and the three of us like this, let's just go ahead and do it. We'll see you back next week, folks. You and Becky Beebe did a very interesting little take apart of the TIF program the other day on your radio station, where you went and talked to Alex Holt and interviewed her, and then very rudely potted down her tape while she was talking, so you could talk over it.
It was in an effort to explain this stuff. So if we could get in the weeds for a minute, as a refresher, TIFs are these special taxing districts. It's a defined geographical area wherein any growth in property tax revenue over a period of time is diverted away from things like schools and park districts and the all-important mosquito abatement district, downstream libraries, right? And it goes into this TIF piggy bank, and this TIF piggy bank money is spent on economic development, maybe schools, maybe planters down the median within the TIF. Correct.
Unless they transfer it out, but
unless they transfer it out, but that's a ball of wax, can of worms. So the debate has been what to do with the surplus TIF money that's jangling around in all these piggy banks at the end of the year. The mayor has to declare this surplus, and then it would be distributed equally back to the taxing bodies where it hasn't been going for the life of this TIF. So this was one of the big debates in the city council the other day that prompted Alderman Arena to do this procedural move, and the threat of Council Wars 2.0 was about this TIF stuff. But what we basically tried to do is break down how the city calculates its TIF surplus. I basically went to Alex Holt, the budget director for Mayor Rahm Emanuel, and said, okay, show us the math, which we hadn't heard about before. And they said, we're starting with $1.7 billion in all these TIF piggy banks across the city. About 1.5-ish is dedicated to projects. That leaves what they said was like $180 million. And then they start subtracting from the $180 million for things like modern schools across Chicago. It's a massive school building program. There's bond money to that. And then, what I call toddler TIFs and tiny TIFs. Toddler TIFs are younger than 3 years old. They take those off the table. Tiny TIFs, if they have less than $1 million in them, they take those off the table. So basically, we walked through the math, and you could see it on our website. And it gets us down to $49 million this year for a surplus, half of which about goes to CPS. Say $9 million goes to the city, but getting to that number has been hard to do, and it's been hard to get people to walk us through that math.
I think one of the biggest problems with this is you have to trust their word on money that is what they call encumbered.
There you go.
They have not detailed.
I have to interrupt you for just 1 second, because Al just sort of like glossed over the fact that there's 1.8 billion, right?
1.7 total, 1.5
billion,
encumbered,
and of course,
right.
1.4 of that is encumbered. So let's figure out this little pie over here. Well, the real question is that 1.4 really encumbered, and for what? And can you show us those numbers?
And that's what's difficult to do unless you pine through hundreds and hundreds of documents.
But he also promised, he had a TIF commission when he first came in office, and that was one of the main recommendations, is that, and they have improved it. You can go on the website and you can see TIF by TIF, which is far better than previous administration. But what you can't see is exactly what that encumbered number is, and what is it encumbered for? What is this money waiting for? I want to know what contract, what contractor is waiting for that money. Show us every number, and they have not done that. And we've written editorials calling on them. You're not going to settle this issue. I mean, we're just supposed to take your word, and that's a difficult thing for.
And of course, the other question that has just been hanging over us for all these years since this started is this a good idea? Is it a good policy? Is it a good policy that I pay my tax bill and somebody strips whatever percentage of it is right out of it before anything happens and throws it in the mayor's desk drawer for him essentially to use as he sees fit. Is that good government policy?
I think TIFs, when used appropriately, if they were used for blighted areas as they were originally proposed, are a good economic tool, but they have been too abused. I mean, if you look at the city of Chicago, what is it? 2/3 of property in the city of Chicago is within some sort of a TIF district. They've been too widely used, and they need to be phased out. And I do think the Emanuel administration has been better about letting old TIFs expire and not approving new ones.
I talked to a lot of TIF experts around Chicago about this, and I was talking to one woman named Rachel Weber from UIC, and the way she put it was, kind of what Kristen's saying, this is good for targeted ideas, but Chicago has created this monster whereby anytime anybody wants money for anything, they go looking for TIF money. And Chicago has a lot of what they call area-wide multi-purpose TIFs, and what that basically means is instead of a TIF created to fund a single project, okay, so instead of a project in search of a TIF, you have these TIFs that are just kind of open, they just kind of exist in search of different projects. So they're not targeted enough, and these were the findings of Mayor Rahm Emanuel's TIF task force a couple of years ago. But we have a lot of those. It's a much broader program than it is if you go, say, in the suburbs and they say, okay, we want to build senior housing on this corner, just this project, this is what it's for, then we close it down. In Chicago, it kind of hangs open for a little while. What else we got? We got this surplus.
See, that's the issue. It's like, I have no doubt that Alex Holt, who has been on this program and has been a friend of mine for a long time, he used to work with her, I have absolutely no doubt about her competence and her ability to manage this budget in a very precise way. But the question that still hangs out for me is not about the fighting over the 2 million and the 20 million and the 30 million. It's fighting over that 1.4 billion. And is it really doing the stuff that we want done? And you have to ask yourself, Kristen, if we had not, Ben Joravsky has done this math and it has been assailed by some people, but if the board, the Chicago Public Schools had not had this money removed from their budget over all these years, they would have had $1.5 billion of their own that they could have spent on school improvement, physical projects, if nothing else. But that money has not come to them, and the answer is, well, we do build schools once in a while with TIF money, or we do.
Well, they also are spurring economic development and creating future taxpayers in the system, supposedly in areas where you didn't have taxpayers.
Right.
So you're opening a new business. That business long term will be a taxpayer contributing to the.
But
to the
as
schools.
we've all observed, too often those businesses are on LaSalle Street or in places where there is absolutely no blight whatsoever.
Absolutely.
And that has been the abuse that has tainted this program from day one.
And they extend them. They go for 23 years and then they approve another extension of the TIF.
Which gives me the chance to sort of pivot a little bit, because to me it's a very similar thing. What bugs me about the TIF program is not the things it has accomplished, because it has accomplished a lot of good things. It's the fact that legislators have essentially said, we don't like the way the system works right now, where you have to go through government to get stuff done. We want to rip the money and put it in a separate pool that we can run without having to go through the public process. And it reminds me so much of the debate that was going on in Springfield about mandatory minimums for gun possession. It's the same kind of thing. I've been railing about this on the program here for a while now. It's like, okay, we're not happy with the results that judges are giving us. And so therefore, we're going to create laws that will circumvent judges. We're going to just simply say, we're going to take judgment out of this. You do it, you go to jail.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same thing. It's legislators who are responding to public anger by trying to take the public process away and just go around the law and do it and do the thing they want to do.
It is. I mean, that's an example of impatience, with the system maybe versus well thought out public policy. But I'll say this because we've editorialized in favor of mandatory minimums for unlawful use of a weapon. And we're generally not in favor of mandatory minimums. They've been abused. Again, you throw a Get Tough on Crime bill in front of the General Assembly, they're going to pass it. Who can vote against it? So that, again, has been abused. But when it comes to this particular crime, there is enough data out there to show that if we do not crack down on unlawful carrying of loaded weapons, we are going to continue to see these sorts of crimes where, I mean, gang members know that the juveniles can carry the weapon and they don't get in trouble. We just have too many cases where people are charged with this crime and then they are not cracked down upon and they go out and commit another crime.
Do you seriously think that your average gang member is going to be deterred by having an extra year thrown on? I mean, it's like, oh man, I'm not gonna go out and shoot nobody today because that's it. I'm gonna get 3 years instead of 2. I mean,
I think they've got the system figured out a little bit. Maybe not across the board, but yeah, I think there are some cases where when you know that you can't be packing and you're gonna get a mandatory minimum 3-year sentence if you're a felon, then yeah, I think that does have a trickle-down effect.
So why don't judges do that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think judges are presented with...
they're presented with evidence.
They're presented with a lot of evidence from both sides and prosecutors who try to throw everything at these kids, and that tends to be the charge that gets pled out. I'm not saying it's going to solve all the problems, but when you look at other cities like New York, they will tell you that they have seen... And they've seen decreases in their prison population because once there is an expectation that this is what your charge is, this is what's going to happen to you, there are fewer people carrying. I don't know. What do you do? What do you do when I'm covering stories about Hadia Pendleton and the back of the yard shooting? In both cases, people who had previous UUWs that got dropped to lesser charges, and they go out and they hurt people.
It's one of the weird things about doing a job like this. It's like I can sit here, in the comfort of this studio and complain about these things, but I don't know what the answer is either. And I don't think really people of goodwill really do have a clear answer for these things. They get very, very complicated.
And that's why it got held up in Springfield.
Yeah.
So
speaking of complicated, if there's anything more boring than TIFs, it's pensions. And we also love to talk about pensions. So there you go. We're going to do it whether you like it or not. There was this weird thing that happened in Springfield last week where all of a sudden out of nowhere, the Chicago Park District, I mean, well, you can explain this, but there was some kind of a settlement with the Chicago Park District that looks like it just came out of nowhere, and they have they resolved their pension problem?
They passed a pension bill that includes a lot of the components that we think make good pension reform: raising retirement age, asking workers to pay more, guaranteeing that the system, the Park District will actually pay in. So, I mean, it did come out of nowhere. Mike Madigan was a sponsor in the House. John Cullerton was the sponsor in the Senate. So John Cullerton was sponsoring a bill that he had major planks that he has previously declared unconstitutional over and over and over. So it was a very bizarro world.
Yeah.
But the big question is not really so much on the ask of the employees. My concern is whether or not the Park District can continue to keep up the pace of payments that they're supposed to make. They are going to sell bonds, basically borrow money in 4 years, up to $50 million to keep their end of the bargain. So it's just this, this cycle of, can we really afford to keep this, the type of pension plans in place that we have?
The question I have is what this could possibly, maybe, depending on what Governor Pat Quinn does, what it could mean for Chicago's pension crisis. I mean, we saw Mayor Rahm Emanuel try to push a bill through with the police sergeants union, a smaller police sergeants union, in February. They had a deal that kind of rhymed with some of the ideas that are in this bill, and the police sergeants union overwhelmingly rejected this. This Park District bill has some other pieces of that, but if this goes through, if it survives a legal challenge, which it sounds like could be an issue, what does this mean? Could this be the template that they want to put on Chicago's other pension funds?
That's the big question, isn't it?
That's a big question, and it's, I've heard people inside the pension world in Chicago say, well, we know that the mayor's administration is trying to start small, pick off a small pension fund, a smaller one, don't deal with police and fire or muni yet, and see how this one goes. So I think I'm watching it as a test balloon. I was interested, the mayor praised this pretty quickly after this thing passed the General Assembly. He said it reflects a balanced approach of reform and revenue. And if you recognize that language, it was from his budget speech that he gave.
He praised it because he wrote it.
When he was talking about what he wanted to see out of a pension bill. So I think this is a good bellwether to look at. Maybe not the end-all be-all, but if you're a pension geek like I am, and I know Kristen is, it's definitely something to keep an eye on for Chicago's pension crisis.
And it's interesting because again, I tend to be very sympathetic to people who say, hey, I worked for the government for 35 years. I gave them my thing. I paid my dues. I did all the things I was supposed to do. And now you want to just take it away from me because you never paid your part of the pensions? Where's that at? And I am extremely sympathetic to that. But I will say that reading the thing with the Park District, I kind of was like, I was almost like joining the Tribune editorial board on this one because it's like, because it was like, okay, let's say the minimum age for retirement doesn't have to be 50. Let's look at that.
Exactly, 50 for Park District employees, and they're only raising it to 58.
Yeah.
So that's a
and
reason.
And we are all living to 80, 82 years old.
And this does not impact later workers. If you are 45 or younger, you're not all of a sudden going to, expecting to retire next year and not be able to retire. I mean, that's the sort of give and take that I think is very reasonable.
And I do think, I think it just stands to reason that we do have to, the situation as we have it now is not workable, and somehow or other we have to begin changing the numbers, and we have to change those numbers in accordance with the fact that our lifestyles and our bodies are just different than they were 50, 60 years ago. We live longer, we live more healthily.
It's pretty fundamental.
Yeah, and it's a really critical issue. So what are you looking at on this coming week? We have exactly 2 minutes left. What should we be looking at?
Well, does anyone else feel that we were robbed for tallest building this
Yes.
week?
Oh, that!
If anybody needs an inspector general, it's that council on tallest buildings, because
and not just the
that
council.
is crazy.
There was something actually called the Height Committee that decided this,
right.
which is like, this all sounds made up to me. Like it sounded like a fake story at first.
We do
I was like, are we being punked?
Yeah,
Really?
the Height Committee. Yeah. That's something my little brother would think of, right?
But in fairness, they've been around since all the buildings have been built in Asia, and they've had these standards. But I gotta say, even though we just sound like a bunch of hurt Chicagoans sitting here whimpering this morning,
we're hurt Chicagoans.
I mean, come on, look at that thing. I mean, I sound like Rahm Emanuel, but look at that thing on top of the building. It's not an element of that building by any means, but it's the World Trade Center. If that building had been built 6 blocks away, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
That was when I read there was so much ink in just explaining this, and this is an architectural feature. All you had to do was look at the pictures. One has a roof that's here, and the other one has a roof that's here.
And what is a spire? What is it? What does it do?
Yeah.
Does it beam information out? Does it help us? Does it? It doesn't make any sense to me, and I feel fine taking a position.
Like I said earlier, it's like we got to get the Donald in on this, because if anybody would think about having a big spire, it would be Donald.
But cynical newsrooms all over Chicago had just a heyday with Freud jokes all afternoon, and that's what made it a good news day, just for the Freud
it's
jokes.
First they took away our airport, and now they've taken away this. It's like, we have nothing. We got nothing left. We don't even have parking meters anymore. We got nothing.
We have the most debt.
Yeah, we do have
our debt is way taller.
And as Jon Stewart pointed out last night in a very funny thing, they did give us murder capital, but they're capable of killing more people than we are. We got to go. Thank you, Kristen. I really appreciate it. Kristen McQueary from the Chicago Tribune, and of course Al Keefe from WBEZ. Hope you'll be back very soon. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. You can see us anytime you want on CAN TV, but you can also watch us anytime that you would like in the middle of the night by looking at this address right here on YouTube. And you can subscribe to us on iTunes, and we'll come over to your house and do the show there if you like, if you're still watching. See you next week. Thank you for watching.